Leiter, and this is week 2 of this series, this executive leadership series, kind of with the general theme of leading through crises. That's certainly what we're in with this pandemic that's impacting every area of our life. Last week we talked about leading remote teams. It's certainly a timely topic because a lot of organizations have sent people, most organizations have sent people to work from home, and a lot of folks haven't done that. So that was a discussion we had last week. Anybody that missed that, I'd be happy to share that with you if you'll send me just a message. This week, Mark Johnson, my presentation partner, is on point. So he's just going to kind of lead us through an open discussion, and at the end of it, we'll do questions and answers. And feel free to put your questions in the chat. And at the end of the conversation, we can handle the questions in the chat, or we can just handle questions live. So let me just kind of introduce Mark. He's, if you can see the screen, you see my big head on top. Mark's right below me. So Mark's a technology guy. He's an executive technology advisor. He's been a chief information officer for great big global billion-dollar companies with, tens of thousands of employees. And he's also kind of been on the startup side. So he's been what I call the inside guy, meaning the CIO, and the outside guy, meaning kind of that third party expert and consultant. So I think Mark's got a really kind of cool blend of big company technology experience and small company technology experience. And that's a great background so that you understand different aspects of business, different aspects of scaling, different aspects of risk involved to business. And so I'm excited to have Mark kind of walk us through this conversation.
Thank you, Mark. I really appreciate that nice
introduction.
So today we're talking about business continuity planning, and it's a topic that there's a lot of misconceptions about business continuity planning. It's a very important topic that should require a lot of attention from companies, but too often we don't really pay attention to it until there's a crisis. So I'd like to discuss kind of these 4 key points we have on the screen here today, and then at the end we'll talk about each of these areas. So let's talk about, there's a lot of different types of crises that could impact a company. So currently we're in a pandemic. Probably wasn't a type of crisis that was on a lot of people's radars until recently, but it's one that you can see has a pretty serious impact to companies' operations. There can also be natural disasters, and that's the one that probably most companies prepare for and we see most often. But there's also cybersecurity attacks and technology failures that can significantly impact your organization. And then there's always this threat of terrorism. Fortunately, we haven't seen this in a while, but it's always lingering out there. And there's many others as well. These are probably some of the most common. And then the other thing we have to think through is a combination of these. So if you can imagine the state we're in today with this pandemic and everybody working from home, what if your organization had a cybersecurity attack during this? And now all of a sudden you lose some technology capabilities or the ability to have your employees work from a remote location. What would that do to your organization? So you can see there's a lot of different scenarios that we need to think through and plan for. So why do we need to have a good plan? Here's an example, some stats from the University of Texas that, when you lose data, for example, it's pretty devastating to the future of a company. And so a lot of times people think of business continuity planning of how do I just keep my company from going in the ditch if I have a crisis? And that's very important, obviously. You have to prepare for that and make sure that doesn't happen. But the other thing we have to think about is there's also some real great opportunities out of any kind of crisis. So here's some examples of companies that were actually started back during the last crisis of 2008, which kind of may be surprising to a lot of people. Some of these companies are billion-dollar companies that were started during a crisis. And even if you're a well-established company, there will be companies that gain market share and those that lose market share coming out of this crisis. So the point here is your level of preparation and recovery planning will greatly drive how you fare coming out of this crisis. So let's look at kind of what are the key components that make up a great business continuity plan. So often when you talk about this, most leaders think of just a crisis management plan. That's what people think a business continuity plan, and that's an important piece of it. It's basically the piece of what will you do during a crisis? You know, how will you run your operations? How will you respond during a crisis? That's very important. Too often when I talk to business leaders about this, they think, oh, that's the plan that my IT people have, right? No, that's an IT disaster recovery plan. That's specifically about how they'll recover their technology capabilities when they have a technology disaster of a type. So that's important as well, but there are two distinctly different plans that need to be coordinated together. Another important piece is risk management planning. So risk management is the piece that you do before any of this that says, what are our biggest risks? What are the things that we could do now in advance to help mitigate some of those risks or lessen the impact when we do have a crisis? There's probably a lot of companies during our current crisis that have looked back and said, wow, if we'd have thought about this before, we could have better made it through this crisis and handled some of these risks better. So risk management planning is really important part of this, to be proactive as part of this planning. And then the fourth component of this, which is something that so often people miss altogether, is what I call the recovery planning part. So recovery planning is what you'd be doing right now, thinking about how will we come out of this process and this crisis smoothly, and then what are the opportunities? How can we use this as a time to gain market share and hit the ground running faster and better than our competitors do coming out of this crisis? So on a question I often receive from business leaders is, how do you get started? Sometimes it seems a little bit overwhelming. You know, people will pull out this 200-page business continuity plan and it seems overwhelming. So I always like to make it really simple as to how do you get started and how do you do it successfully. So, the first step is always the hardest, and it's getting it started. And it really is about getting executives to say, this is important to our company. And it's a piece that we're all going to participate in and perform. And you assign the appropriate people to lead this effort. And typically what we've seen in most companies, they don't really have an internal expert that kind of knows the ins and outs of business continuity planning. So it's always good to have an external coach or facilitator that can guide the group and help them sort through the issues that come up as they're preparing these plans. Then the group would go through and prepare, all the inputs. What are the risks that we're trying to mitigate? What are the objectives? So you need to know what's acceptable recovery times for each department and each group. What are the options that we could pursue to address those? And then you build a plan and you look at all the processes and the people and how it's going to work together, and you build a timeline for rolling it out. And then the more important piece is executing it and actually making sure it works. So often I see companies build a plan and it ends up in a 3-ring binder and up on a shelf, but they haven't properly tested it and optimized it on an ongoing basis. So educating your team and executing it properly is really key. And then no business is static. Every business continues to have changes and grows as time goes on. So you have to continue to reassess this plan and refine that as the business changes, and to keep it also top of mind with everybody so that it's an effective plan that's always ready to be executed. And that's probably one of the most important pieces to understand about this planning is it has to be actionable. If it's just a bunch of impressive documents in a binder, that's going to be of minimal help. It has to be something that you can actually execute when the day comes very smoothly and it's top of mind and everybody really understands their role in the plan. And one of the things I always express to business leaders is, while every employee may not know every line of the business continuity plan, they should know these 3 things. they should know their role in this and what's expected from these three things as part of their role and their group that they're leading. So, make sure when you build your plan that every employee knows these three areas. One of the things we always build with companies that I work with is a communications process. So the current crisis we're going through has kind of had an extended duration, meaning that it lasts for a long time. But other crises, such as, for instance, a cybersecurity attack on your business, where your data is being stolen or PCs are being destroyed and areas of your company are being shut down, every minute that passes is critical. And too often what we see is that one person will find out about it and they'll start working on it, but they forget to tell everybody else. And a long time passes before the word gets out that, hey, we got a problem. We all need to come together and deal with this. So this is just an example of a simple 8-step process we built for the company to say, hey, anybody that hears about a crisis, follow these 8 steps to make sure, one, you communicate out that there's a problem and you get the people participating that should be helping out with the problem. And you have a process that you're going to follow through to quickly address this in a timely manner. One of the things that I've observed in this current crisis, and it's pretty common in any crisis, is the companies that have very solid, robust digital capabilities have fared much better. Some of these companies were really caught flat-footed when the time came to say, look, we had to have everybody work from home. They just weren't equipped. And their operations were not very digital and were kind of bound to an office or bound to a setting. And it made it very difficult for them to transform to this crisis setup where people could work in different locations. So digital capabilities are really critical during a crisis. And I think it's going to be a critical component for any business going forward, even in good times as well as crisis. So probably the most important part of this is, what should you be doing right now as a business leader? One of the things I point out to everybody is, what a great time to go around and talk to all your department leaders and say, document what you just did over the last 2 or 3 weeks. If you have a plan, confirm that the plan worked. And what were the vulnerabilities or things you wish you had done differently? This is a great time to accumulate this knowledge. And for those that didn't really have a great plan, this is a great time to have every area of your business document what they did. It's a great starting point. If you have that documentation, you can at least get that as your first draft of putting together what a plan should look like. So this is a great time to build upon and optimize whatever business continuity plan you currently have. The other piece is, it's also a great time to really start looking at your digital capabilities. Again, those that have them are going to fare not only much better in a crisis. People, you've seen in the news for a long time, people talk about digital transformation over the last year or two. And it truly is a race that will make a difference in the future for every industry. I talk to business leaders in oil and gas and retail and other industries that say, does digital transformation really impact my business? And my thought is absolutely. An example I give them is, I remember years ago, I was working with a retail company, and they said, we're an old-fashioned brick and mortar company. Does digital really make any difference in our industry? Years later, this company named Amazon came along, and they found out how important digital was. So if you don't have an Amazon in your industry yet, you will eventually. So you want to make sure your digital capabilities are robust and are positioning you as a leader going forward. So how do you get started into this? As I mentioned earlier, the hardest step is the first step. It really is all about the business leadership, setting it as a priority for the business and saying, this is something that we're going to do as a company, and to put that in motion. If you'd like to have a deeper dive into this conversation or a copy of the material I just shared, contact Dr. Hinderleiter or myself, and we'd be glad to talk with you more about it. So that said, Mark, let's open it up for some discussion.
Yeah, love to lead off with a question, if you don't mind, Mark. So, y- y- so we're 3 or 4 weeks into this current crisis in terms of companies reacting and sending people home and those kind of things. So, what would you say to somebody that says, "Hey, man, this sounds really like good stuff, but this horse is way out of the barn. Right now, we're just working on survival." Are there some things that people can still do now on the recovery side during this current crisis?
Absolutely. So it's a great question. And I think there's two parts to that. So you're right. If you're in kind of a survival mode right now, you have to look at what are the pieces of the plan you have to shore up to get you to a stable state, obviously, and position yourself to be able to continue through this crisis phase we're in today. But I think also in parallel with that, though, you have to start planning for what's that recovery look like. So who knows whether it will be 2 weeks from now or 2 months from now. At some point, we will come out of this crisis.
Yeah.
And it's about starting now the conversation to say, what are the opportunities we have? What are the resources we need to kind of queue up? You know, what you'll see is when companies come out of this crisis, there'll be some companies that are flat footed for another month or so that are still trying to figure out kind of how to get things going, and employees will go to the office and they'll kind of be in a lull for a while to get things going, versus the company that's really prepared for that recovery that says, when we get the green light, we're going to hit the ground running and really seize the moment.
And so there's a lot of work to do leading up to that,
That's
isn't there? With your workforce, with your clients, with your customers, so that everybody's engaged, so that we can get out of the gate quickly.
That's right. And it really begins that first step we talked about. It's about the business leader setting this as a priority for the company, building the right internal team to drive this, and to monitor the progress and to get feedback from their team as they would any other major project for the company, if you will.
Yeah.
And then they need to have the right knowledge to know how to drive such a planning process.
So I want to invite anybody just to kind of unmute and jump in here with a question, or you can put it in the chat, and and we'll get Mark to respond to that. So really, just Mark, a comment. I'm going to piggyback on something that you said. So one of my client companies have done exactly what you said. They put together a crisis management team, and they're just really on top of communication strategy. Um, equipping their workforce to work virtually, equipping their plants to work in this environment and still be productive in this kind of this safe what's social distancing. So they've done a really good job, but they've also created another group that I thought was just pretty smart, uh, that are really looking at opportunities. So one group is really the crisis management team,
Right.
and they're doing a bang up job. I'm on their town hall call every week, um, and they're just doing a really terrific job of communicating and deploying and just talking, in very candid ways about what's happening, what needs to be done, what people can do to help, and just doing a terrific job. But I think the fascinating thing is they're also have a group dedicated to looking at opportunities,
Exactly.
and I think that's really smart. Um, I've got a different client who's in the business of selling promotional products that are very event related. Like the Houston Texans kind of gear and stuff like that. So that business kind of really slowed down dramatically about 3 weeks ago, and they figured out a different kind of opportunity of tapping into their supply chain and finding some PPE, which they're not even in the business of PPE, personal protection equipment. And now they're in the business of PPE within the span of about 3 weeks, and have some pretty significant orders, because what they did was they tapped into a company's strength of managing supply chains, of getting product, from suppliers and getting those products to their customers. And so it's using that same strength of managing supply chains and sourcing suppliers, and just it's kind of what you said of looking at opportunities. So to me, that's a really important part of coming out of this thing, is really putting some people together and thinking about, one, how do we get out of the gate quicker, but two, you know, can we be doing something that's just pretty different, to serve our customers in a different way, or to serve new customers.
Right, right. Great point, Mark. And I think the other key point you made is this is something you have to really tailor to your business. So a plan for a 100-person company looks very different than a 5,000 employee company.
Yeah,
So you
yeah.
really have to kind of think through what fits for your organization. Mark, in the chat, Rod had a question. It's a great question. He said, how far should we plan for a combo crisis that I mentioned earlier? Imagine if we had a COVID and cyber attack at the same time. Is it worth planning that deep? It's a great question. And my feedback is, how devastating would that be to your business? So if you were to have your technology disrupted due to a cybersecurity attack, if it has a devastating impact, yeah, I would go that deep. And I don't think it's as far-fetched as it may sound. So the reason is, when everybody's sitting in an office, your company has a lot better cybersecurity defenses to deal with these type of attacks than when you have all your employees working from home. You're far more vulnerable. And I tell you, in the last week and a half across the board, I've heard feedback that the phishing emails, the ways that attackers get in have gone through the roof. I mean, I get probably 2 a week where, to explain a phishing email, it's a fake email that looks like it came from your bank or from Apple, and it says your account's about to be closed. Click here if you don't want your account to be closed. It's trying to entice an employee to click on a link or an email so they can get into their PC and then into your system. So hackers are seeing this work from home as a real opportunity and a vulnerability to get into a company. So yeah, I think it's something you have to think through, at least at a high level, and say, what would we do? And know what your options are in that scenario, so that you're not caught completely flat-footed. Because if you were to lose your communications capabilities suddenly and you had no plan, it could really be disruptive. Did that answer the question?
Yeah, Mark. Thanks a lot. That was that's really a good answer, and I think it's measured appropriately for the kind of business you're in.
That's right.
So when we're doing continuity planning, do we necessarily have to plan for specific events? So here's our plan for a hurricane, here's our plan for a flood, here's our plan for a pandemic, or is it more general that if our business is disrupted, we can't work in the office, we can't run the plant? So, I mean, do you have to think of every eventuality, or is it more general kind of contingency planning?
You usually start with the general as your first
Yeah.
phase, if you will, your first version. And then you'll modify that, say, now, out of this plan, what would change under this other scenario? So pick one of the crises that I showed on the screen, and you'd say, natural disaster, let's build our plan around that. And then you look at that plan and say, now let's test it. One of those steps was to test your plan. As a group, you'd say, let's test this plan to say, what would change if we had another type of a crisis? If we had a pandemic or we had a cybersecurity attack, what would we need to augment in this? So typically, you kind of have a baseline plan, and then you have kind of versions off of that that says, and if we had a loss of ability to go to the office, for example, this is what we do to mitigate that. So you wouldn't have 8 different plans. You'll have one with some various options off of that based on the different scenarios.
Mark, one of the questions in the chat is, how often should we, once we put together our plan, how often do we visit it? Is that once a year, twice a year? I mean, is that every year, every couple of years? What's your experience there?
Yeah, I recommend once a year. Typically companies do a strategic plan that may be a multi-year plan, but they at least revisit it once a year to say what's changed, what's modified from the last time we had this discussion. So it's the same kind of thought process with this. You're going to have your plan, your business continuity plan, and then you're going to revisit it once a year to say, have we added any new businesses? Have we changed anything in the business that may change some of these scenarios? And at least you revisit it to make sure it stayed fresh. And the other important piece to do once a year is to keep it top of mind with everybody. So even it's just a reminder out to the employees to say, if we were to have a crisis, remember these are our steps, or here's the documentation where you'd find your documentation for your department. So it's about keeping it top of mind as well.
So one thing I'm kind of remembering, Mark, is back in my corporate days, participating in, we've called it different things, disaster planning and continuity planning. So I'm going to confess right now, I had a hard time getting excited about it because I'm thinking I fight a crisis every day in my day job.
Yeah, right.
Why should I get excited about crisis planning when I do it every day? But now that we see,
Right.
we've all experienced, depending on where you live, we're all experiencing this COVID-19. For those of us in South Texas and the Louisiana Gulf and some of those areas, we've experienced hurricanes and floods and those kind of things. So we have had to kind of take it more seriously than I probably did 10 years ago.
Yeah, it's a topic that people just usually say there are things more pressing that we're dealing with right now. And they kind of put it on the back burner until the day happens. Then they wish they'd kind of given it more attention. So it's a very important topic. And you're right, though, it tends to get kind of moved to the low priority list until it happens. So yeah, I think that's the challenge for the business leader with so many other pressing things to deal with every day. How do you get this queued up where you have the right level of planning, the right detail of planning? The big piece is, that one piece I talked about, the one component called risk management.
Yeah.
If you look in advance as to what are your biggest exposures to your business, what can you do to make sure those key cogs aren't totally disrupted during a crisis? That's a kind of a bare minimum you should do. I mean, there's probably healthcare organizations across the country that are saying, wow, if we had thought about this, we'd have ordered more masks, more ventilators. I mean, there's always going to be the after the crisis planning that says, now that we know this, we'll do something better going forward. So it's an ongoing process. You're going to build a plan that's based on your most likely scenarios, and then augment it continuously as the business changes or more information. And it really depends on your company as to how critical technology and other pieces are to your business. So I'll give you a great example. I don't know if everybody's in the state of Texas, but in Texas, there's a grocery chain here named H-E-B. If everybody's familiar with H-E-B. So H-E-B was featured this month in Texas Monthly. And they are featured for all the business continuity planning and crisis management planning that they had done in years in advance of this. They have a person that their title is Director of Crisis Planning. Full time, that's what he focuses on. And what are these different scenarios that they may face and how do they prepare for it? So for a business like that, it's a very serious ongoing focus for how they'll deal with this. Now, not every business will be able to afford to have a full-time person that does this, but it can be at least a company-wide initiative that at some point in your planning process, you incorporate this.
So maybe last thought before we sign off is, how would you encourage people to think about putting together a recovery plan so that their company gets out of the gate as quickly as is practical, once the all clear whistle blows?
Yeah. As I went back to that as 5-step process, I think that applies to any of the components, which is the first step is the hardest, which is start the dialogue.
Yeah.
As a leader, get people, all your key leaders on a call like this and have a conversation saying, look, we don't know right now if it'll be in 2 weeks or 2 months or 3 months, but we will need to be prepared to come out of this recovery running, and have that conversation as to how do you prepare now to come out of this running, and then have the conversation about what are your opportunities. What are your opportunities to actually grow during this opportunity? There's going to be some of your competitors that aren't going to be prepared that you may be able to grow your business during this time. So the first step I mentioned is the key step, is start the dialogue, have the conversations. If you get stuck in some of the dialogue, have a facilitator that can help you kind of get through it and actually start building that plan out.
Yeah, very good. Well, hey, Mark, thank you. This was a great conversation.